Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, the weekly political analysis show. I know I said last week we were going to talk about the midterms that are coming up next year. Instead, I want to talk about the political news of the week, and then next week we will talk about the midterms. So, our first story is about the federal takeover of Washington, D.C., and then I'll give you some of my thoughts as always. So, President Trump took control of D.C., the police department more particularly, early last week, declaring at a press conference at the White House in the White House briefing room saying that Washington, D.C. will be liberated today. And if you're not aware, because Washington, D.C. is not a state and is in fact a federal territory, Congress has authority to directly control Washington, D.C. And I think it's pretty unfair, but that's a story for another time. So Trump claimed using the Home Rule Act of 1973, which allows Congress to oversee D.C. It allows him to control the city's police force for up to 48 hours, and it's the first time that this act has ever been used. Control can only last for up to 30 days, and after that, Congress must approve it, and I don't think we're going to see that happen with the current makeup of the House and the Senate. So why is Trump doing this? Well, this comes after a former Doge employee known as, and I'm not kidding, Big Balls, was attacked. President Trump says crime is a huge problem in the city, and that is actually true. So the liberal media has been telling people, they did so at the beginning of last week, that crime is at record lows in DC, and that is not true, and I will explain it here. Homicides in 2022 were higher, or in 2024 were higher than they were in 2016 or 2006 to 2019. So we had that 14-year period there where crime was actually lower than it is now. So it did come down in the last few years, but it remains elevated. And by the way, I have the statistics in the description if you are interested in looking at it. So most crimes did drop from 2022 to 23 to 24 and from 24 to 25, but it remains elevated as I expected. However, President Trump said that DC has a higher rate of murder than Mexico City and Bogota, Colombia. And I believe he also said Baghdad, Iraq as one of those cities as well. So is this true? Well, there are 26.7 murders per 100,000 people in DC, which is very high. Baghdad has between 100 and 185 per 100,000, which is astonishingly high, much higher than DC, 5, 6, 7, 8 times as high. Obviously, as a third world country, getting data from there is very hard. So we can't exactly know. That's a big range, 100 and 185. But what we do know is that Baghdad is definitely worse than DC. In 2022, there were 12.9 murders per 100,000 in Bogota, Colombia, and in Mexico City it was 8.1 murders per 100,000. So DC has double the crime rate of Bogota and 4 times the murder rate of Mexico. Although I will caveat, we are comparing 2022 data to 2024 data. However, in 2022, the murder rate in DC was even higher than it is today. So if anything, we're doing DC a favor here. And I will also say that the murder rate in DC was 29 back then, so it has come down a little bit, went from 29 down to 26.7, but that's still fairly high. I will also say that Detroit, Atlanta, Baltimore in 2022 had worse crime rates than DC did back then and today. And I'll share that back in November, I was looking around Detroit and I saw a house for $13,999. And I'll put a screenshot of it up right now. I cut out the address because somebody actually lives there now. And I put it on my social media as a joke. And I said, oh, Detroit, here I come. And there's a reason that Detroit houses suck. And I don't know if you know anything about Detroit, but Detroit is a city that nobody wants to live in. The population has been dropping rapidly. Nobody actually wants to live in Detroit. And you might wonder, well, why does nobody want to live in Detroit? Well, there's industrial decline. That's a big issue there. And Dylan, as I said, he's been on the show before. He said that I get killed for wearing the wrong color T-shirt as I walk down the street. So so gang violence is a big problem there. So that's an interesting story. I thought I would throw that in there. And Detroit is definitely worse than DC. We know that for sure. But don't you think there are other there's other cities the president could target, but DC is an easier target because it's under the control of the federal government. So why did he target DC? Because of that. And also, I suspect there is some immigration aspects as well. He is doing this because he wants to control immigration. I think that is the story here. And then there's the story that violent crime might actually be underreported. The police commissioner has been accused of manipulating the data. I don't know much about this. And the police commissioner I believe he's suspended with pay right now. And the union is accusing him, and he denies it. I'm not going to talk too much more about that. I don't really know, and unless you're a DC resident, you probably don't really care. I definitely believe that it's certainly possible that the data is being manipulated because the crime rate has fallen in the last few years, and there's really no reason that that's happened. You could say the economy's a bit better. It went up in 2020, 2021, and 22, and it started to come down since then. But the economy's not really any better now than it was in 22. Inflation's lower, but prices are still high. So you would think, what are they doing this year they didn't do last year? Nothing. And frankly, I've been disappointed in our liberal media for years now, and they lied about this. They absolutely did. They did say other crimes are down, but one, there's not that great detail about it, and two, we're comparing a high number to another high number. So as I said, we know the murders went up in 22, so it's very likely that the other crimes also went up in that time. So just because the murder rate spiked and now it's coming down, and it's only coming down a little bit in certain categories. I think overall violent crimes down about 7% and property crimes down a little bit more. But we know, and murders are too, but we know it's still astonishingly high. And let me see. So we're also, I know in Caracas, Venezuela, their murder rate in 2022 was 90 per 100,000, and in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, they are at 27.9, so almost the same as DC. So does this justify the federal takeover of Washington, D.C.? Well, in all honesty, I think so. Our nation's capital cannot be a third world hellhole. We cannot have that. That's our country's capital. And I definitely think this is a base move, and I would have thought it would be better if the president ordered that D.C. get its crime rate down by itself, and if he didn't say within a year, then he'd take over the city. But it's obviously too late for that. So we'll move on from that story. And probably the most important part of this week was President Trump met with the Russian dictator in Alaska at the end of last week. And I'm recording this on Friday since I leave for the vacation tomorrow, so I can only give you what I know as of now, which is not very much, but politicians do love to mess with my schedule. Ahead of the meeting, which did not have the EU or the Ukraine president, and I'll admit, it did seem a little bit shady because this war is really none of our business. We're not on the continent. We're not one of the people. We're not on one of the sides. I guess you could say we're on Ukraine's side, but we're not actively in the conflict. At least, hopefully, we never will be. And before I derail ourselves, that I want to say that they established red lines. So what are red lines? Red lines are basically like they are boundaries that they will not cross, and I'll explain with those in a little bit. Steve Witkoff, the special envoy for the administration, said that exchange of Ukrainian territory might be required for a ceasefire, and as I'll explain in a little bit, they did not end up getting a ceasefire at this meeting. Now, here's what I say, and I think European leaders would agree to the same thing. They do not want to give up any territory until a ceasefire has been agreed to. Ceding territory is a trap, especially before a ceasefire. Once they give up a piece of territory, then they will be ordered to give up more and more and more. And as I said last episode, a ceasefire must come first. Zelensky said the starting point for negotiations must be the current battle line, and I absolutely agree. So we have our stalemate. The Russians want territory given up, especially in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't want to give up anything before a ceasefire. And that will probably explain why things have been so stuck recently. Not on the battlefield, but diplomatically. So Ukraine said back in March, these were their red lines. They will not cede any further territory. Thousands of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia must be allowed to return. And the thousands of civilians held illegally in Russia who are not prisoners of war must also be returned. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, there must be an international security guarantee in case the war begins again in the future. So I think everything except the first one, not ceding any land, is definitely possible. Of course, I think the returning of civilians held illegally in Russia, that should absolutely happen. Thousands of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia, that they should absolutely be allowed to return, and vice versa. And then security guarantee, that will absolutely be needed. And then the last one, not ceding any territory, that is pretty unlikely because even before this war technically began in 2022, Ukraine was already lost some of that territory. They did not have Crimea, and they did not have parts in eastern Ukraine. And the first thing, President Trump, he said that the meeting in Alaska will only be to negotiate a ceasefire, which didn't end up happening. And the next logical step of this conflict would be to to negotiate a ceasefire. And a ceasefire is supposed to be a temporary temporary halt to fighting. So whenever they were saying in Gaza, oh well, we need a ceasefire in Gaza, well, that was never a permanent solution. You don't want a war to end just in a ceasefire, because a ceasefire is just what the name says. It is ceasing the gunfire. Then Zelensky, he wants to get Zelensky and Putin to meet face to face, which seems improbable, and indeed it was. So what happened at the summit? Well, nothing concrete. And at a press conference, President Trump said that there was great progress that was made, and there was a press conference with Trump and Putin and the world's media watching. The media didn't get to ask any questions, of course, but which is a little unusual, but that's what happened. And Trump said, quote, "We didn't get there, but we made some good progress," and he said he'll have to call Zelensky. So he said, "We didn't get there," quote, "we didn't get there." And in the press conference, Putin said, "I agree with U.S. President Donald Trump that the security of Ukraine must be secured. And of course, we are ready to work on that." Now, here, if you don't know anything about this conflict, the strange part is the people that are threatening Ukraine's security is Russia. So if Russia wants to stop threatening Ukraine's security, they don't need to negotiate that. They can just do it. Well, Ukraine can't just do it because they're the ones that are being attacked. And my guess is it's not surprising that he said this. It's a little weird, but he would kind of have to say that. That's something he would have to say. And they took no questions, as I said. Putin proposed a meeting in Moscow, and as I expected, no deal was announced. There will probably not be a meeting in Moscow. Zelensky definitely would not go to Moscow, and if I was Zelensky, I would not go to Moscow either. It's a little bit tricky because there's not that many places Putin can go now and not get arrested, because most of the world has him under arrest warrant. I thought we did it until very recently, and so Putin couldn't go to like Paris or something. He would have to go probably to a Middle Eastern country. They could do a peace summit maybe in Beijing or in India. And as I said, Trump wanted a ceasefire. He said he wouldn't be happy with that one. And I think that he thought he could charm up Putin, get Putin to stop, and then declare victory. And I hope he realizes this is going to be harder than he thinks. He should have known this months ago, but it's better late than never. So moving on, inflation in the month of July came up to 2.7%, below expectations, but it was a little bit higher than last time. So that's not a good sign, but in actuality, it was coming, and we knew that. We've known that for months. Wholesale inflation, which is what retailers pay, came up to 3.3%, which is the highest in, I think, about 3 years. And that's quite high. And I'm not sure if we talked about this last week or the week before, but the July jobs report came up significantly below expectations, and May and June were dramatically revised down. So here's the problem for the Federal Reserve. They have a dual mandate. The mandate is to keep unemployment and inflation low at the same time, which is very tricky because usually in economics there's a curve, I think it's called the Phillips curve, where it says the lower unemployment is, the higher inflation is going to be. So the idea of keeping them both low is very difficult. And they did a good job in the 2010s, but that was basically because there was not that many supply shocks around the world in 2010, between 2010 and 2019. The Federal Reserve would normally raise interest rates to slow inflation. However, because of the tariffs, even if interest rates are jacked way up, I don't see prices coming down. Keeping rates at the same also, which is what I kind of support, has its own dangers because it allows the economy to worsen, especially under the hood. Lowering rates could exacerbate inflation, pushing inflation even higher. So the Fed really has no idea what to do here. Other economies like the UK and EU have been gradually lowering rates. I think they've had 3 or 4 rate cuts since the last Fed rate cut, which I believe was before Trump even took office. And the Fed will meet in September. Nobody really knows what they're going to do there. I think there's a growing consensus that their rates should be lowered, and until very recently, the markets had it at like 90% chance of a rate cut. I'm not so certain about that. I would put maybe at a 60% chance. And I think if the economy worsens in August, which we'll find out in about 3 or 4 weeks, then there will definitely be a rate cut. However, we can't know that until we get there. If it shows a worsening economy, then we will lower rates. If the economy is kind of, then I think we're going to stay where we're at. Meanwhile, the president, who is clearly not happy about this, really only has himself to blame here. He was the one that whacked up the tariffs. If we had not had these tariffs, then I would imagine that we probably would have had at least two rate cuts this year, maybe 3 or maybe even more. He was the one that cut taxes to fuel our deficit back then and today. He blames Biden, and Biden definitely has some blame here. But that blame is rapidly diminishing because he's no longer setting government policy. Biden left office it's August, so he left 7 months ago. He left office in 7 months ago in 2 days. So he's not setting government policy anymore. Yes, policy has lingering effects, and we all know that, but the ability to blame is dropping quickly, and people in the mind of the public, I think most people have moved on from that. And I think the greatest irony of all is that tariffs causing higher prices is exactly what is keeping the rates up, and he knows it. Lastly, and this is our last story this week, and it will kind of transition into the episode about the midterms that comes out next week. I'm going to talk about that next week. Gavin Newsom wants California's lawmakers to approve a bill that would give Democrats more seats in the House of Representatives, counteracting Republicans' moves in Texas and possibly in Ohio and Florida. And right now, California has an independent commission, and this commission decides House district boundaries. But if this bill passes and it has to be approved by voters, if it passes, then the commission will be overridden until 2031 when the next map is made because of the 2030 census. And as of this recording, I emphasize, as of this recording, the map that was leaked shows Republicans losing 4 safe seats. 3 of them will become safe Democrat, 1 will become leans Democrat, and they will also lose another House seat. And a leans House Republican seat, that will become safe Democrat. And then a leans Democrat seat will become safe. So Democrats will gain 5, and in Republican wave years, or in Democrat wave years, there will be 6 seats. So in 2026, it will be 5 seats, maybe 6, which would completely offset the losses in Texas. Unfortunately, this would reduce the number of competitive seats in the state of California from 5 down to 2. And I'll talk a little bit more about redistricting in next week's episode, which was already recorded, and that's why I can't go back and edit it. It's already recorded. It will come out next week. And that is it for this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and that is it for my summer vacation as well. I will be going back to school in just a couple of days, unfortunately. So that is it for this episode. As I said, thank you for tuning in. As always, you will hear from me again next week with a pre-recorded episode. Bye-bye.